All right, so today's topic, water-wise gardening. We're going to talk about the general principles for maintaining, or using minimal water while still maintaining a beautiful outdoor space. We'll go into a little more detail about native plants and how to arrange a drought-tolerant landscape. And then we will touch on grass cycling toward the end for those of you who are maintaining lawns at home. The reason we teach this topic probably comes as no surprise to any LA resident. We do use much more than our share of water here in LA County. Often we're in drought conditions. We import most of our water. And even though I think most of us were probably raised or taught to practice water saving strategies inside the home, like turning off the faucet when you brush your teeth or taking shorter showers. Unfortunately, 57%, sorry, some road noise, 57% of water use in LA County still just goes toward outdoor use. And some of that is beyond our control as individuals. It's things like estate lawns and golf courses and parks. But if you do have a yard that you're maintaining, we really want to provide you with all the information and tools we can to really lessen that water footprint, so to speak. So we'll start by just briefly talking about the 6 main concepts, and then I'm going to dive in deeper on a few of these. So the first is pretty simple. It's called hydrozoning, but all that really means is grouping your plants according to their water needs. And while it's simple in theory, it can sometimes be a little bit easier said than done, particularly if you're establishing new plants in your garden next to previously established plants. So it does take a little planning. If you have the luxury of being in a position where you're planning out a whole new space all at once, then this is a perfect opportunity to create some well thought out hydrozones. And you would consult with your nursery professional about the watering needs, both initially and over time for each type of plant that you're purchasing. And then you would just group them so that you can strategically apply water to those zones, whether you're doing it by hand or installing an irrigation system. Plant selection, that really comes down to, we want you all to choose drought tolerant and ideally native drought tolerant plants for your gardens. It goes without saying that they take less water, and in many cases native plants have other advantages as well, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. Irrigation, the cardinal rule is really to water the soil, not the plant, to water as close to the root system as possible. In most cases, overhead watering is not ideal and is actually pretty wasteful due to the evaporation. So, soaker hoses, drip systems, bubblers, emitters, there's different ways to go depending on the type of yard that you have. Improving your soil really comes down to, it usually comes down to adding organic matter to your soil. That's pretty much always going to help with the permeability and the water retention. So if you have heavy clay soil, for example, adding organic matter such as compost will help it to help the water to drain more quickly. If you have sandy soil, it will help it to retain more water. So we'll do a little demo in a little bit, but oftentimes the existing topsoil in your yard or garden could use some amendment with organic matter, and that really does not only help the water retention and the structure of the soil, but it also helps the fertility of the soil. Mulching, another cardinal practice for gardeners, especially here. A good 2-inch thick layer of mulch on top of the soil is going to really dramatically cut down on your watering. So always apply mulch. And then if you do have a lawn that you're not really using, we encourage you to consider replacing it. And we'll talk briefly about the rebates available for doing that. So let's start by talking a bit more about irrigation. There's different ways to go. It's going to really depend on the type of garden you have and on how intimate of a relationship you have with your garden. So over here on the left, you see it's an edible garden. So often if you're a hobby gardener growing edible gardens and annuals and that type of thing, you're probably going to be interacting with your garden more frequently. And in that case, it might make sense to just hand water, you know, use something like this with a spray nozzle and something that isn't going to disrupt the soil, as opposed to just hitting it with the hose stream. And that could work very well for you. However, if you are more of a hands-off gardener, maybe you just want to plant it up with low water natives and just forget about it, or perhaps you travel a lot or work late hours, then drip irrigation is going to be probably the best choice for you. Some sort of timed irrigation system that you can just set it and forget about it. And smart irrigation systems are those that actually detect the weather, and so they know to shut themselves off when it's raining, which is a pretty cool feature. So we're going to go into a bit more detail about hydrozoning, and I'll do a little activity in just a moment. But this here is just to really illustrate using different colors to identify each zone, what a strategically hydrozoned yard and garden would look like. And you'll see that this theoretical home has all sorts of different things going on in the garden. So there's natives, and there's succulents, there's an edible garden. Oh, where's our edible garden? Well, the edible garden is definitely present in the activity I'm going to do. Rain barrels. Oh, there we go. There's our edible garden. A little bit of turf over here. So this is really just to show that each section has the plants grouped strategically. So let's go ahead and walk through this a little bit. With our activity. Okay, so here we have kind of a deconstructed version of what we were just looking at. So over here on the left, we have the house, and we're going to imagine the backyard has a small patch of grass that's being kept, you know, maybe for playing on or whatever, and then a couple of established trees. And now we're going to look at our different elements that we want to plant, and we're going to group them according to the hydrozoning principle. So let's get started with our natives. So we're going to take some native grasses and just put them over here along the parkway in front of the house. And since we're hydrozoning, we're going to add some additional natives over there as well. So we've got, you know, some purple sage, maybe some hummingbird hyssop, some pineapple sage, lots of varieties to choose from, and we'll go over those a bit more in just a moment. So we're going to put the natives in the front yard along with the native grasses, because this is all one hydrozone. And in the case of native plants, that's probably going to be no irrigation installed at all, because once they become established, they don't need to be watered regularly for the most part, unless we get a really horrible, long, hot drought. Once established, and that's key, once they're established, native plants can exist, can survive and even thrive just on our natural rainfall. So the reason I keep saying once established, though, is that they do need to be watered until their root systems really get entrenched in the soil and acclimated and deep enough to find the water that they need. So if you're planting natives for the first time, and you don't install an irrigation system in that area, then you're going to need to hand water. And the frequency and the schedule for tapering off is going to depend on the variety, but generally speaking, over the first few weeks, you'll be keeping them evenly moist. Over the next few months, you would pull back to watering maybe once a week or so, and it really can take 1 to even 2 years before you get to the point with natives that you don't need to water them at all anymore. So our hydrozone in the front is most likely going to be no irrigation installed, but with the knowledge that if you're planting for the first time, you will need to get out and hand water until they become established. All right, and then we'll go ahead and we'll do some succulents in the back. So succulents also a great low water option, but they do need more water than other types of native plants. So with succulents, it will depend somewhat on the variety, but they're gonna want to be watered maybe once every 1 to 2 weeks. So you are gonna want some sort of irrigation zone installed over here, unless you're intending to do hand watering. And I can't quite, there we go, we got it to line up. And then we're gonna go ahead and put some edible plants right outside the back patio here, so it's easy to pick some fruits and vegetables, and that's going to be on its own hydrozone. Generally speaking, our edible gardens, they're going to need more frequent watering, particularly during the summer. You're going to want to make sure that that soil isn't drying out. So again, it's going to depend on the weather and the time of year, but perhaps every other day or a couple times a week, depending on the weather conditions. But they're definitely going to need more water than your succulents and certainly more than your natives. And we'll go ahead and add a hedge over here. So this hedge is going to be another drought tolerant option. Perhaps something like natal plum, which would have similar watering needs to the succulents. So that would all be on the same zone, even though I didn't place them near each other. So we'll come back to this in a moment to address those other elements, but hopefully that provides a good snapshot of what it means to hydrozone. So going into a little more detail about those native plants that we so strongly advocate for. Drought tolerant plants are great. Obviously they use less water, but there are some drought tolerant plants that are beautiful and you know, water friendly, drought friendly, but they do have some disadvantages. So a couple of really popular options that I've seen are Mexican feathergrass and pampas grass. And if you're familiar, these are both beautiful, fluffy looking grasses. The problem with that is all that beautiful fluff, those are the seed heads, and those seeds spread rapidly, and those types of grasses are non-native and can quickly become invasive and choke out native species. And so that's why you really need to use caution with non-native drought tolerant plants. Again, you could consult with your nursery professional or visit one of the resources that we'll share in just a few moments to learn which non-natives are adapted. But you do want to know your plant so that you don't run that risk of endangering the native species in your neighborhood. Other advantages of native plants is that they are typically pretty easy to care for. They require not only less water, but less pruning and maintenance. They attract pollinators and native wildlife to the garden, which is always lovely. And you know, this last picture is really just to show that there's different ways you can dress them up. You can incorporate other elements like bioswales, which we'll talk about in a moment, rock gardens, dry riverbeds, that type of thing. So a little bit more about native plants. Really what we're trying to illustrate here is the variety of color and texture and patterns you can get with native plants. So just because you're planting a low water garden doesn't mean it needs to be a cactus garden or a rock garden or just, you know, drab. There's a lot of beautiful color out there, and we have some examples here on this slide. Sages and lavenders are great because they're also fragrant. I mentioned natal plum before. Those white flowers have a lovely scent. It makes a great hedge. It's lush looking. The fruit is actually edible. You know, you can always go with edible herbs like rosemary. So these are all great options. And then I do have a few with me to show y'all as well. So just, you know, beautiful bouquet of natives here. What I have today is the popular name for this one is lion's tail. It's got the fuzzy orange flowers. I have a couple varieties of lantana. What I love about lantana is it comes in so many different colors. So I didn't even pick all the ones that were available, but you got yellow, orange, purple, pink, and yellow. Another great option. And then this here is hummingbird hyssop. So another beautiful, showy native plant that, true to its name, attracts hummingbirds. The cool thing about native plants is you can often see how they've adapted themselves to their low water conditions. So they'll often have features like, often smaller leaves, so to minimize the evaporation of water. Sometimes the leaves will have a waxy or fuzzy coating for the same reason, or a silvery sheen, like in the case of saltbush, to reflect the sunlight and help minimize evaporation from the leaves. So it's fun. I always find it enjoyable when I go for a hike to observe not only the fragrances and the colors of all the plants around me, but to notice how they've adapted themselves to their low water conditions and managed to thrive. We do have some resources over here if you want to really learn a lot more about native plants. So the Theodore Payne Society is great, as is the Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. Don't know if they have it on here. I have another one that it might show up on a later slide, but there are different places in LA County where you can go to learn more about and purchase natives.
Okay, Erin, here's the first question. Do succulents attract lizards and spiders?
Oh, I don't know that they do any more than any other element in the yard. I haven't heard that they do. I mean, certainly, though, we do see a lot of lizards in native environments. So we know they like drier conditions. So I wouldn't be surprised. And succulents are typically low water plants. So it's possible. I think just generally speaking, any yard that incorporates more low water plants and practices is probably going to have more lizards. Spiders, they show up pretty much everywhere. I found it would probably just depend on the variety of spider.
Can a hydroponic system be considered water-wise gardening?
They are very efficient. So I would say yes, because they are very efficient. Yeah, if you wanted to grow edible plants in a more water friendly manner.
Thank you. Can animals like gophers mess with drip or smart irrigation systems?
Ooh, my guess would be yes, because gophers mess with everything. So yeah, it's really hard to really control what the gophers choose to gnaw on. So unfortunately, I think the answer to that question is yes.
Thanks, Erin. Let's move on.
All right, so let's talk about soil. So as I mentioned, most soil compositions are a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Sand would be composed of the largest particles. Silt, they're smaller, they're more medium-sized particles, and then clay has the smallest particles, so they're really glued together. Each type of soil kind of comes with its own challenges. The ideal soil type or topsoil type, so again, referring really to the mineral composition of the soil, you're going to want a cocktail of all three, so to speak. So ideally 40% sand, 40% silt, 20% clay. Really heavy, high clay soil is difficult to work with. Really sandy soil can also be a challenge because of the way the water runs right through it. Silt is better, but all of these types of soils really do need an addition of organic matter to really be ideal and to have the right structure and to hold water, and then of course have all those nutrients you get from the organic matter in the soil. When you have that, when you have your ideal composition plus the organic matter, then you have loam, which is dark and rich and crumbly and has that beautiful odor of rich soil. So I'll just do a little activity here just to break things up and make it a little more interesting. So here I have a jar of silty soil. It's also got some rocks in it and a few twigs, but it's kind of, not nutrient rich soil, just some dirt I collected from a pathway at my community garden. And we're gonna see what happens when we add water to it. So you see the water, it's kind of puddled up right on top there. It's not really absorbing very well or very evenly into the soil. We've got, now that it's absorbed, we have our dry patches. It's kind of got that look of brownie mix, right, when you start to stir it, but it hasn't fully been mixed up. So that's kind of what we've got with unamended silty soil. Here we have some very heavy clay soil. So you can see on here these dried chunks of clay. They're hard as rocks, really. It's very hard to get the water to penetrate clay soil very well. So you add the water. Again, it's sitting right on top. Those hard clay rocks are just sitting there completely undissolved. And then once it does soak in, it can get trapped. So the problem with heavy clay soil is that the water can get trapped. It doesn't eventually flow through, and then you can get root rot. So clay soil, also not ideal. And then here we have our beautiful loamy soil. You know, it's dark and rich. It's got plenty of organic matter, has a lovely odor. And so let's see what happens when we add water here. It's absorbed very nicely, very evenly. It's distributing well throughout the jar, and you don't have that puddle sitting on top. So when you water good soil, what you usually get, and I can never capture it quick enough to show, but you get this moment of glisten on the surface of the soil. So you add your water, and after a second or split second, it absorbs. You see that beautiful glistening on the surface of the soil, and then it goes to matte, and that's how you know the water has absorbed nicely into the soil. So just a quick little demo to show why soil structure and soil type is important for water retention and water distribution. Get back to it. Now, if you do have problematic soil, like it's very heavy in clay or just so sandy, it's worth noting here that some drought-tolerant plants, and particularly succulents, do like soil that's a bit sandier for that very reason, that you know, it doesn't hold as much water. So there are some plant types that like it a bit sandier, but for most plants, they do like more of a loamy soil, especially for, you know, edible and flowering plants. And so if you have soil that's so tough to work with in your ground soil, like it's heavy in the clay or really sandy or just poor silty soil that requires so much amendment that it's just not really worth the money or effort, you can always go above the soil. And so raised planters are a really great way to not only improve your soil, but also customize it. So like I mentioned, if you wanted to plant a succulent garden that likes sandier soil, you could create a raised bed over there for that. And then you could have another raised bed for your edibles that was higher in the compost and the organic matter and the nutrients. So here we just have a few different options to consider for creating some sort of raised garden. All right, and let's talk a bit more about mulch. Really key to your gardening success. Not only does it help retain water in the soil, but it cuts down on weeding, which is great. All gardeners hate weeding. Most gardeners hate weeding. So mulch is a great way to mitigate weeds and conserve water in the soil. We have a few different varieties here. Organic mulches are great because they break down over time and add more organic matter to the soil. And that does mean that they need to be replenished, because you do want to keep, you know, good 2-inch thick, at least, layer of mulch over your soil. But, you know, just keep in mind that it will need to be replenished if you're using organic mulch that decomposes into the soil. Another important consideration with mulch is if you're planting seeds, make sure that you leave the space above the seed clear of mulch so it gets the sunlight that it needs to germinate. And also you want to keep mulch clear of like trunks of trees and you know, the stems of plants, because you don't want rot. So you just want to keep it a little bit clear of the immediate stem or trunk, but otherwise, you know, be liberal, really cover your soil with a good layer of mulch. I have a few options here. So this one, this is just forest material. So it's like bark and wood. It's really high in carbon. It's kind of chunky. You know, good mulch for protecting the soil and for cutting down on weeds. Again, it's mostly carbon content. It has beautiful odor when you first open the bag. It smells like the forest. And then this one here, this is grow mulch. So you see the pieces are a little smaller, and this is typically marketed to be used as either a garden soil or a mulch. The reason for that being that it has those woody carbon-based forest materials, but it also has some manure, which adds nitrogen. So it does have both carbon and nitrogen, which does add, it fertilizes the soil more so than just a totally carbon-based mulch like this one. I typically prefer not to plant 100% in this because I do find that it's still just a little too chunky and piecey. So I do think it makes a better mulch than it does planting soil. But this is one that's going to break down and filter into the soil more quickly. So it'll probably need to be replenished more often than a bigger, piecier mulch. This one is just something that you might get for free from a tree trimming company. So the problem, that's great because tree trimmers are a great source of free mulch. The only thing is you don't necessarily know where it came from, what kind of tree it came from. So this one, in this case, I believe is eucalyptus, which would be more suited for a pathway than for a garden because the eucalyptus oil can inhibit the growth of certain types of plants. So just something to be aware of. You do want to know the origin of your mulch if you're going to be using it around your plants. And you'll notice this one's a lot piecier too and chunkier, so it doesn't have quite the same nice structure. And then finally, this is one of my favorite types of mulch. It's just dried up leaves. Sometimes it's called leaf mulch, sometimes it's called leaf mold, which is really just, all of that means it's just decomposing leaves. And the nice thing about this is that it's full of a lot of good, rich biology, you know, and life and microorganisms that add life to the soil. So this works great as a mulch that does also break down and really help enrich your soil over time. All right, get back to share. Over here, we do have a few sources for free mulch. LA City Sanitation does still do distribution, I believe, but double check. With COVID, you know, some things are not currently operating as usual, but usually there is free mulch distribution. You can also contact your waste hauler to see if they distribute free mulch. In many cases they do. As I mentioned before, tree trimming companies, great source of mulch. There's a website, I believe, is it a website or an app, or maybe it's both. It's called Chip Drop. And that's a place that connects tree trimmers with people who are looking for free mulch and wood chips. And then, you know, other cities might have their own mulch giveaways, just like some cities have their own compost giveaways. So always worth checking with your city's website. All right, let's talk a little bit about rain barrels. This is a great way to really, well, rainwater is great for your garden. It's actually better than tap water. So that's one great reason to use rain barrels. And they're very simple to use. You just, they collect the water from your rooftop. So all the water that would fall on the surface area of your rooftop normally flows into your gutters through the downspout and then, you know, out into the street gutter and drains out to the ocean. With rain barrels, what you would do is you would saw off the downspout from your rain gutters and you would install it underneath, and they fill surprisingly quickly. So one good rainfall could fill up a rain barrel. And then that rain barrel's capacity, if you have a modest sized garden, it might actually supply most of your garden's water needs. So they're just a very efficient way to make use of rainwater that would have otherwise essentially gone to waste. They come with a screen to keep out insects, and you can attach, you know, a hose to the spigot and just use it directly to water your garden with. Now keep in mind, this isn't treated water. It's not what it would need to be treated and filtered and if you wanted to drink it. And because it does collect the, the particulate matter and the pollutants that are on your rooftop and in your gutters, it is advised that if you're going to be using rainwater to water an edible garden, that you hold off on using the rainwater within a week of harvest, just for safety, and that you, of course, wash everything thoroughly before you eat it. So just a couple safety practices if you're gonna use rain barrels. And there we go. Bioswales, it's a little bit of a different approach. It's also a way of making the positive use of our rainwater. You don't get to collect it for your later use, but the way bioswales work is they're essentially just trenches that are dug, maybe 6 to 12 inches deep, and then you can fill it with either organic matter, your wood chips, compost, rocks. You could plant it up if you'd like. But the purpose of a bioswale is to collect rainwater that normally would hit hardscape, or maybe, just DG or some sort of impermeable material, and then just run out and get lost out to the ocean. What bioswales do instead is collect that water and use it to recharge our groundwater supply. So even though you're not keeping it for your own use like you would if you were using rain barrels, what you are doing is facilitating that water making its way back down to replenish our groundwater supply, as opposed to just running out to the gutter. It also helps to filter the water. So it's just I think it's a very elegant, interesting addition to a garden that could be incorporated into your overall landscape design. So with that, we'll go back to our activity and add in those last couple elements. So we have our rain barrels here, and we'll just go ahead and install them at these downspouts. And then you'll see in the back here how it says there's a slope at the rear of the backyard. So that would be a good place to put a bioswale, right at the base of that slope, because then you're taking advantage of the natural topography of the yard and helping to direct that rain flow into an area where it can be kind of captured and filtered and encouraged to raise the water table a bit. Get back to our presentation. Now, if you do have a lawn that you're not using, we do encourage you to consider replacing it, because lawns do take typically a fair amount of water, as well as fertilizers and other inputs. So the purpose of this picture is just to show, how you could take what was sort of a lackluster lawn and replace it with all these beautiful xeriscaping elements. So there are resources, financial incentives to replace your lawn if you're motivated to do that. So we have those listed here. Cash for Grass through LA County, and then Be Waterwise also offers some rebates, and then through the city as well, LADWP offers rebates as well. So you can check out both the county and the city resources. But if you do have a lawn and you choose to keep your lawn, we're going to talk now about how to be a responsible lawn owner. So grass cycling, it's a really very simple concept. It's just the idea of the practice rather, instead of collecting your grass clippings in a bag and disposing of them, that you instead allow them to just land back over on your lawn. So remove the bag and let them just basically blow back over your lawn and filter back down into the grass. And the reason for that is, there's a couple of reasons. One is that those cut pieces of grass act as an instant mulch for your lawn. So they filter down between the other blades of grass and they protect the soil from the sunlight. They're also pure nitrogen. So freshly cut green grass is a rich source of nitrogen that you are essentially allowing to break back down into the soil. So you're basically fertilizing your lawn with your lawn, which is pretty cool. And there's another important component to grass cycling is that you do follow the appropriate mowing height for the type of grass you have. So we do have those listed here. It's really key that you not cut your grass too short at any given time. You don't want to remove more than half, even maybe a third of the height of your grass, and you don't want to cut it too short. And all of this factors in with that idea of protecting the soil from water evaporation. So I usually compare it to getting a buzz cut, right? So if you imagine you cut your hair very, very short, more of your scalp is exposed, right? But if it's allowed to grow a little longer, then the hairs are basically shading your scalp. So the longer the grass is, it also acts as what we call a living mulch because it shades the soil. So very simple concept, grass cycling, and we certainly understand why people have gotten in the habit of collecting and disposing of their grass because you don't want it clumping and being tracked into the house. But if you follow the best practices, if you always cut your grass when it's dry, if you're not cutting too much of the length at any given time, you shouldn't get those big clumps. It should filter down more easily into the lawn. And you're really, in that case, just creating a healthier lawn ecosystem. And that way it takes less water, takes less fertilizer, and you're just overall increasing or improving the longevity and the beauty of your lawn. So that's grass cycling. We have some online resources here. We have some repeats of some of the ones from the presentation. So we have the Cash for Grass link, in addition to some other resources about some of the topics we talked about today. So if you're interested in learning more about drought-tolerant plants, this link here at the bottom is going to provide more information, and actually have some notes because I do want to mention by name some of the local resources for that. And once everybody's had a chance to look at this slide, I'll move on to our point of sale page. But in the meantime, do we have any questions, Edgar?
Yes, we have several questions here. The first one reads, as an apartment rental, I can only have containers. How many times should I water my edible containers throughout the day?
Okay, well, it's going to depend on the container. It's going to depend on the plant. So edibles, again, they do need more water. It will depend on so there's some containers that lose water more quickly, right? So a terracotta, an unglazed terracotta pot, for example, the water is going to evaporate more quickly than a glazed terracotta pot. Plastic containers tend to hold moisture in better. So typically, it will also, of course, depend on the weather and the time of year. But typically with edible gardens, you're probably going to need to water in the summer a few times a week, unless they're not getting a lot of sun. But if they're getting a lot of sun, probably at least a few times a week. But what you really want to do, your best indication is going to be to check the soil. So you don't want the soil to ever dry out more than the top 2 inches. So you really just take your finger and stick it in the soil. And if it's dry below those top 2 inches, then you need to water. So that's really going to be your best indication of whether your plants need water. Now, if we're talking about newly planted seeds or just babies, little seedlings, those need to be kept evenly moist until they become established. So until they're at least 2 inches high. So in that case, you probably would need water every day during the summer, especially if they're in the sun. But once your plants are established, your best indication is really just going to be to check the moisture in your soil.
Can mulch around the plant base cause rot? I have oleanders that seem to be suffering because there are several inches of oleander leaves as mulch.
Yes, so you do want to clear the stem or the trunk. So in the case of a tree or a really established bush, the trunk, you do want to make sure about around an inch is clear of mulch so that you don't get rot in the bark.
Can we use oleander leaves and branch as mulch for edibles? Is it poisonous?
Oleanders are poisonous, so I would not advise it.
All right. I have heard that it is challenging to fix clay soil on your own using compost, etc., and that it is better to simply buy a lot of amendments to fix the clay issue. Is this true?
Um, if it's really heavy clay soil, then you might need to purchase some additional amendments. That is true. Compost might not solve all of your problems if it's very heavy clay. So I think limestone might be one of the popular amendments for clay soil. So yes, and it really does it just takes work. That's the problem with clay soil. It's interesting, just a personal anecdote. We have a community garden, a couple plots in community garden where the soil is pretty heavy clay soil, and we didn't even amend it. We just planted in it, and it was more work, digging and kind of loosening the soil. But our plants actually did amazingly well, and it was an edible garden and produced a whole lot of food. So, sometimes the looks and the feel of your soil can be deceiving. I think with clay soil, you just really need to be prepared to put in a little bit of extra work when it comes to, if you're okay with tilling, a little bit more tilling and just loosening it up that way.
Okay, so the next question is, can we reroute, for example, dishwater and kitchen sink water to barrels outside to water plants? Does dish soap hurt plants?
So that would be a gray water system. You certainly can do that. It's important that you use biodegradable dish soaps. So there's definitely brands that are labeled as biodegradable and earth friendly. And so as long as you're using those and you have like a gray water filtration system, then yes, I've definitely worked in gardens that have used gray water systems, even to grow edible plants.
Thank you, Erin. Next question is, do bioswales have pooled water that might attract mosquitoes?
They shouldn't. The way a bioswale should work is there shouldn't be any standing water. It's more of a filtration system. So they should be filled with some sort of organic matter, like maybe mulch, or if you had access to a whole lot of compost, that would work. Wood chips, you could plant in them if you chose. But the idea is not to let the water pool up, but to help it filter downward.
Okay, we are at our last question now. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to type them in now. This is the last question here. Is it beneficial to seal or line the side of an interior of cedar wood raised beds for edibles?
Well, I don't think there are any issues with cedar being toxic in any way. I think cedar is a fine wood to use for edibles, so I don't think you would need to seal it unless the purpose were to prevent water evaporation. But I would say there's no need to do that. Yeah, I don't think that would be necessary, and I definitely wouldn't want you to use any sealant that had any toxins in it.
All right, I do have some questions of my own, Erin. The first one is, do certain natives attract different types of insects?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's different natives that will appeal to different types of, pollinators, butterflies, beetles, that type of thing. For example, most of us are familiar with milkweed attracting butterflies, and there are particular varieties of milkweed that are native to California, and monarch butterflies are kind of notoriously picky. So that would be a good example of a specific variety of plant that you would plant to attract a specific insect.
Thanks, Erin. I believe you just answered a question that just came in as well.
Okay.
All right, it looks like we're all done with questions, Erin.
Okay, well, I did want to share a couple more native plant resources just because, I share the knowledge that I have, but my area of expertise really is more with edibles. So for those who want to go, to a source that truly can dive very deep into the topic of native plants, There's the Rancho Santa Ana Botanical Garden, which is out in Claremont. The Theodore Payne Society I mentioned earlier, it's in Sun Valley. And then the one I was trying to remember earlier that wasn't listed is the South Coast Botanic Garden, and that's down in Palos Verdes. So just a few options for folks who want to. Oh, and actually, now that I have my notes, I have that website that has more information about natives and particularly native milkweeds. And that, I don't know how to say it because it starts with an X, but it's, I guess it's Xerces, it's XERCES.org, XERCES.org, if anyone's interested in learning a bit more about that subject matter.
Can you say the nurseries again?
Yeah. So they're Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, that's in Claremont, the Theodore Payne Society in Sun Valley, and the South Coast Botanic Garden in Palos Verdes. And there are certainly other nurseries who sell and can inform on natives, but these are just kind of like the big three sort of big experts that are, they're not just nurseries, they're, you know, they're like education centers.
All right, looks like we are all done.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for being with us today. And I guess that's it. Edgar, thank you so much as usual for your moderation skills.
Of course, my pleasure.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in those other topics we mentioned, please do visit smartgardening.com and click on webinars. Bye.